please.
No problem. So you said that God controls human history and destiny, and if that's true, what outweighs the murders of 6 million Jews?
Of course, we don't know exactly what God's morally sufficient reason was for permitting the Holocaust, but there's no way that the atheist can prove that God did not have a morally sufficient reason for permitting this evil. That doesn't mean it was good. To say that God permitted it doesn't mean that this was good that this happened. But it's saying that God allowed the National Socialists in Germany to exercise their free will to do evil. And there may be some sort of morally sufficient reason for allowing that to occur. The atheist is the one who has the burden of proof here to show that God cannot or does not have such a burden of proof. It may be that the Holocaust was instrumental in the founding of the State of Israel, that only such an unprecedented atrocity would have led the nations of the world to return the Jews to their homeland in Palestine. And who knows how God may use the nation of Israel to bless the world. The Bible says that God has plans for Israel to bless the entire world through the nation of Israel. And it may well be that people will look back on those who perished in the Holocaust the way Christians look on the early martyrs in the church. The blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church from which it sprang. And it may well be that future Israelis will look back with gratitude on those who gave their lives in the Holocaust for the state of Israel and for the blessings to the world that God will bring through the state of Israel. Again, we just don't know. The point is that the atheist is assuming a burden of proof here by making probability judgments that are way beyond our ability to make with any confidence.
Okay.
Well, I think the example of the Holocaust very well illustrates the inadequacy of the theistic response to such events. I mean, to say that for all we know the Holocaust was actually for the best, that for all we know God does have a morally sufficient reason for allowing such events, is just implausible. As I said in my argument, in my presentation of the argument from evil, it is true that such events could have a ripple effect, such that they lead to an outweighing good. Although in the case of the Holocaust, of course, it's very difficult to imagine what that outweighing good would be. But the mere logical possibility, because I think that's all it is, the mere logical possibility that such events could have a ripple effect leading to an outweighing good isn't sufficient to undermine our very rational and natural judgment that such events probably don't have a morally sufficient reason, that such events probably don't lead to outweighing goods. We don't know what the long-term effects of such events will be. We don't know what the ripple effects are, but we do know what the immediate and short-term effects are. We do know that such events are great evils, and that, I think, is sufficient for the judgment that such events are probably pointless evils.
So, second question then. So, sorry, we get these two people in here, and then here.
Professor Kim, I'd just like to ask, what would prove God to you? And, you know, as you said, personal religious beliefs can be delusions. As a result, what standard of proof should the theist provide in order for you to become a believer?
Yeah, I don't think religious belief, or religious experience rather, provides a good basis for religious belief, because I think the fact that people of all faiths report religious experiences, and those faiths are mutually incompatible, that only one of them can be true. So anyone who has a religious experience therefore has a good reason to be skeptical that their experience is reliable. As to what would convince me, well, a sound argument for the existence of God would convince me. Compelling empirical evidence for the existence of God. Burning crosses in the sky, were it to be discovered by particle physicists that the words "made by Jesus" were inscribed on every subatomic particle, that would make me change my mind.
Okay.
But I think that it's hard to imagine better evidence for the existence of God than things like the absolute beginning of the universe. the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, a realm of objective moral values and duties, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Surely God has given us sufficient reason to believe that he exists. And I want to emphasize once again that Dr. Kame's argument that of these four possibilities of the outcome of an evil event, that the probability is therefore only 1/4, that it's good, that is a fallacious argument. If I told you I have a bag of marbles with 4 colors, red, yellow, green, and blue, and you pick a random marble, does that mean that your chance of getting a yellow marble is 1/4? No, all of the marbles could be blue or red, or there could be any distribution. We just don't know. It's inscrutable. And so that argument is just demonstrably fallacious.
Okay, 2 more questions down here. So, you too. Yeah.
Hi, this is for Dr. Craig. You drew an epistemic boundary for us to presume upon the will of God. If this is the case, I think this is specifically because there's nothing in our nature comparable to omniscience or atemporality, etc. Well, then how do you justify your argument for the absurdity of an actual infinite, us being finite thinkers?
Okay, how do I justify what?
Your argument for the absurdity of an actual infinite existing, us being finite thinkers. Surely
So
we wouldn't be
are you saying that my argument against the existence of actual infinites is incompatible with belief in the infinity of God? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Or an actual infinity existing in a causative chain. Because surely there's an epistemic boundary there for us.
Now, okay, you tell me if I'm responding to your question. When I say that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist, I'm using a mathematical concept of infinity, a quantitative notion. In infinite set theory, an actual infinite is composed of an infinite number of definite and discrete elements. But when theologians talk about God's infinity, it's not a quantitative mathematical concept, it's a qualitative infinity. It means God is morally perfect, omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, and so forth. And so there isn't any composition in God of an actually infinite number of definite and discrete elements. So as long as we understand this difference between quantitative mathematical infinity and qualitative infinity, I think you can see there's no incompatibility between saying there cannot be an actually infinite number of things, and therefore there cannot be an actually infinite regress of events into the past, and yet saying God is infinite in the qualitative sense of being morally perfect, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and so forth.
Okay. Dr. Kame?
Well, I think there are problems for Dr. Craig's argument for the impossibility of an actual infinite posed by God's infinity. I mean, if God is omniscient, then he knows all true propositions. Now, suppose, for the sake of discussion, that the universe is physically infinite, or that the future is infinite. Well, it follows that he knows an infinite number of truths about the physical universe, and an infinite number of truths about the future of the universe. So in that sense, I think God does actually instantiate an actual infinite. So one of the things I'd like to say about Dr. Craig's philosophical arguments for the impossibility of an actual infinite are that I think all that they really show is that the notion of an actual infinite leads to counterintuitive results. The notion of an actual infinite doesn't lead to explicit logical contradictions. Dr. Craig's arguments, in other words, don't demonstrate that an actual infinite is impossible, but only that an actual infinite leads to certain counterintuitive implications.
Okay, thank you. There's a question next door. These two. Okay. Go.
Okay, this one is for Dr. Craig. You said that only 2 things can possibly exist before the universe. There's only 2 things that are timeless, spaceless, and so forth. That's
yes.
the abstract objects and
an unembodied mind.
Yeah, and the unembodied mind. Well, those are the only 2 things that we can think of from this universe that could have existed before it. But there could be a whole different range of things that could exist only outside of universes. Like just to take an example, there could be several gods that are responsible for this rather than just one. So I think the monotheistic conclusion is just a little too specific, Nelly.
Okay. Abstract objects aren't something that exist in the universe. These would be things like mathematical objects and other sorts of things, but they don't stand in causal relations. You didn't really provide another alternative. What you said was maybe there are more than one unembodied mind, many gods, a plurality of gods. And I would simply say to that Occam's razor would shave away the multiplication of such causes. Occam's razor says you're only justified in positing such causes as are necessary to explain the effect. And one unembodied mind, one personal creator of the universe is sufficient. Occam's razor would shave away additional causes. And in addition to that, I think one could give other arguments for monotheism as well, but I think Occam's razor is sufficient to get rid of that plurality of gods.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Kim?
Yeah, I think Dr. Craig's assertion that the cause of the universe must be a personal being of some sort is based on a false dichotomy. He seems to presuppose that the universe can only have one of two kinds of cause, either a naturalistic cause or a personal cause. He wants to rule out naturalistic causes, and so he's left with a personal cause. Well, there might be other kinds of non-naturalistic explanations of the universe that aren't personal. I think at this very early stage in inquiry, we shouldn't rule out the possibility that there are non-personal, non-naturalistic explanations of the universe.
You're putting it a lot better than I did.
Okay, thank you. So there was a gentleman in the black coat who's next, and then the lady behind who's next. Can you just put your hand up if you still want to ask questions? We'll try and get a map of. Okay. Okay, so if you stand, please, yeah.
Dr. Craig, your moral argument seems to be dependent on this idea of free will. However, there are many Christians who would deny such a thing. Calvinists, for instance, drawing from Romans chapter 6 through 9, would say that God does not merely allow evil, but is in some cases the cause of evil. So why should we accept your philosophical presumption regarding free will as opposed to what would seem to be the revealed will of God?
Well, I would never say that you should believe my philosophical arguments over the revealed Word of God in the Scriptures. But I think that exegesis is quite mistaken. It seems to me that the presupposition of the New Testament is that we do have significant free will. Judaism thinks of human agents not as puppets or robots manipulated by God, but as free persons who are called upon to obey, love, and worship God, and they are morally responsible for those actions. And so I would disagree with those Christians who say that human beings do not have freedom of the will. I would say the same thing to them that I said to Daniel Kame. That reduces human beings to the status of moist robots. And they are not then moral agents who can be held responsible. In fact, as you almost suggested, it would make God the author of evil, which is abhorrent. God is the source of all goodness and cannot be the author of evil. So I would just resist that exegesis of the New Testament that some Christians would accept.
Okay, Dr. King?
Well, I think here again, Dr. Craig is assuming that there couldn't be a naturalistic account of human freedom. So it's just not the case that if we want to preserve human freedom in order to preserve morality, that we have to be theists. There are a wealth of accounts of human freedom that are naturalistic and that don't depend on the presupposition of God's existence.
Okay, thank you. This is the lady in the white jumper.
Hi, this is for Dr. Craig. One of your arguments is that the existence of evil also proves the existence of God. So what I'd like to ask is, if God is, good and he controls the universe, how can there be evil? So does that not kind of contradict that God exists? Like, if evil exists, God exists, but if God controls everything and he's good, there can't be evil. Or otherwise, that would mean that God is not just good, he's also evil. Does that make sense? Should I repeat?
Well,
I thought that was for you, Daniel.
It's for you. I think it was for you.
Oh. All right, well, I found myself resonating with much of what you said as I understood it, that if God is good, then he will ultimately have morally sufficient reasons for the terrible evils that occur in this world, and will hold human beings responsible for the evils that they freely perpetrate. I would just emphasize what I've said already a number of times, is that given the cognitive limitations that we experience, it's in principle impossible for us to say when some incident of evil comes into our lives that we can say, yeah, in all probability, God doesn't have a good reason for allowing that to happen. We're just not in a position to say that. And I think Dr. Kame's argument, based upon the idea that there are 4 possibilities, seem to assume that the events in the world are randomly distributed. And as you said, that's not correct. They're providentially ordered by God. And it may well be that in order to providentially order a world of free creatures with significant moral freedom to his ultimate ends, that God may have to allow a good deal of evil and suffering, like the Holocaust, along the way.
Okay, Daniel?
So you referred to Dr. Craig's argument from evil for the existence of God, and I think that, I mean, if it were true that God is the only possible ontological foundation for objective moral values, then it would follow from the existence of evil that God exists. But as I've said, I reject that premise in Dr. Craig's moral argument. I don't think it's the case that I don't think it's clear, at any rate, that God is the only possible ontological foundation for objective moral values. I think if the moral argument was sound, that is, if God's existence really did follow from the existence of objective moral values and duties, then Dr. Craig would be justified in saying that the existence of evil itself entails the existence of God. But as I said, I don't think the argument's sound.
Okay, thank you. There were a bunch of questioners down here, so there's a question down here.
This one's for Dr. Craig again. Earlier you made the argument that we cannot fully understand God's intelligence in some way and therefore be able to predict his objectives and his motives when he allows an evil act or a good act to occur. However, you also argue that via Occam's razor, right, we can shave it down to only one God, or that we can disallow other solutions. Aren't they contradictory views to be had?
Well, the first part was not quite accurate. It's not that we can't penetrate God's thoughts or his will. It's more that we have certain cognitive limitations on us, like our confinement in time and space, that makes it impossible for us to know what the future holds, or our lack of insight or intelligence. That's why these probability judgments are just beyond our ability. That was the first point. But your second point, yes, I said Occam's razor says don't multiply causes beyond necessity. You're only justified in positing those causes which are required to explain the effect in question. And so your question is what?
Well, if my question is flawed, then there is no question, but I'd like to see what left to say.
Well, maybe. So,
well, if I could respond to what Dr. Graves just said about the inscrutability of divine psychology, because I took it that was an implication of his response to the problem of evil, that we can't reliably judge what God would do or what choices he would make, and that's at the root of Dr. Craig's response to the argument from evil. For all we know, the Holocaust was for the best, because it sets in motion a causal chain that leads ultimately to some outweighing good. We can't fathom God's purposes, and that's on Dr. Craig's view, why we can't make a reliable judgment as to what he would do. And I think another implication of that aspect of Dr. Craig's position is that in the final analysis we can never say whether any event or occurrence is really good or evil. If we can't make judgments as to the ripple effects, the long-term consequences of any event or occurrence, then we can't say definitively of any event or occurrence that it's good or evil.
Okay, thank you. There was a that lady at the end.
My question is for Dr. Kame, and it's about the problem of evil. I was wondering about the application of, I'm not sure, the C.S. Lewis's treatment of free will and the problem of pain, if you're familiar with it, and his argument that if there is to be free will in a universe, then some degree of human suffering is logically required. With regards to the ripple effects, would you find it as unconvincing to say that ultimately, if free will logically requires that God doesn't step in and quickly fix all evil by moral actors, that if God ultimately decides that us choosing to love him out of our own free will is more valuable than us being automatons, is that still not a convincing argument for you that it is imaginable that God might decide that our free decision to love him is of enough value for that price to be paid? And just as a follow-on from that question, do you think the Christian belief as regards the incarnation of God and Jesus' suffering has any relevance to God's decision that some suffering is to be permitted?
Okay, well, I think the free will defence provides a fairly good response to the problem of moral evil, but it doesn't provide any kind of response to the problem of natural evil. I mean, most of the evil in the world is not caused by the misuse of human freedom. It's caused by natural processes and occurrences. So human freedom does nothing to account for the existence of natural evil.
Okay.
Let me say two things. First, natural evil forms part of the arena or theater in which free will decisions are made. And so they're not irrelevant. It may only be in a world which is attended by a great deal of natural evil that the maximum number of people would freely come to find God and his salvation. And I think it's not at all implausible that only in a world suffused with natural evil as well as moral evil that the optimal number of people would freely come to know God and his salvation. Now, to say again that God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting an event like the Holocaust is not to say that the Holocaust was good, as Daniel just implied. That's a consequentialist view of ethics, and I don't hold to that. The Holocaust was evil, but that is a different question from whether one has a morally sufficient reason to allow that evil to occur. And having such a reason doesn't mean that therefore the Holocaust was really good.
Thank you. There's a question down the front, down here.
This is for Dr. Kame. Dr. Kame, Dr. Craig says that the universe had a beginning, and for him, the cause of it is God. Do you believe the universe had a beginning? And if so, what is the cause? And also, at the start of the debate, you said that you have in many ways looked for God. Where have you looked?
Well, I've looked at the arguments of natural theology. That's primarily where I've looked. And I found that none of them is convincing. As to your first question, how do I think the universe began? I don't know. I have absolutely no idea how the universe began. But I reject Dr. Craig's claim that the only plausible explanation for the existence of the universe is a supernatural being. I mean, cosmologists are busy trying to explain the origins of the universe in terms of the laws of physics, and they are optimistic that at least in principle, the universe could be explained in terms of the laws of physics. And as I've already said, I think Dr. Craig's inference to the existence of a supernatural being as the cause of the universe is based on a false dichotomy. It's not the case that the universe could only be caused by some naturalistic process or by some personal supernatural being. There might be some third option, which is some other non-naturalistic explanation.
Can I just say this before I finish?
No. Sorry, I just got to... No.
The charge of a false dichotomy is leveled against an argument that I haven't offered tonight. This is an argument by Professor Richard Swinburne that says there are two types of causal explanations. Explanations in terms of natural laws and initial conditions, and explanations in terms of personal agents and their volitions. And what Swinburne points out is that a first state of the universe cannot have an explanation in terms of natural laws and initial conditions because there is no prior physical state. But it can have an explanation in terms of a personal agent and his volitions. And this gives good reason, I think, to think that the cause of the universe is personal. But the argument I gave was that the only thing that fits the description of a timeless, causeless, necessary, immaterial thing is either an abstract object or a mind. And abstract objects aren't involved in causal relations, from which it follows that the cause of the universe is a personal mind.
Okay, thank you. There's a man in a light blue shirt. Yeah, if you stand, please, and he'll catch you. Yeah, you. Yeah.
I have a question there for Dr. Craig. He mentioned about the Holocaust or evils in general, how even though they are evils in the long run due to the consequences they cause, it might work out better in the long run from a moral or ethical point of view. Now, if God is omnipotent and he's such a great designer, couldn't he have designed the earth in such a way where evil didn't have to happen to create an ethically more sustainable result? Couldn't he have just created an ethically good world from the beginning?
Good, thank you.
Remember, it is the atheist here who has the burden of proof to show that God could have done such a thing. It's the atheist who claims that the evil and suffering in the world is improbable or impossible with respect to God's existence. My point is simply this, that according to the Bible, God's overriding purpose is not to get people to believe that he exists. He could obviously do that very easily by putting a neon cross in the sky. His overriding purpose is to draw people freely into a saving love relationship with himself. And we have no idea whether in a world in which God's existence was as plain as the nose on your face, or in which there were no evils and no suffering, that an optimal number of people would freely come to know him and love him and find salvation. In fact, I think that it's extremely plausible that only in a world that is, as I say, suffused with suffering and evil, that the optimal number of people would freely come to know God and find salvation. Now, is this some sort of airy-fairy speculation on my part? Not at all. If you read a modern missions handbook on where Christianity is growing at its most rapid rates around the world, it is precisely in countries that have experienced severe natural deprivations and moral evils. Countries like China, the Philippines, Ethiopia, Kenya, the Sudan, Ecuador, whereas in Western Europe and North America, the growth rates are basically flat because when people don't suffer, they don't need God. They don't turn to him. They're indulgent. So I don't think there's any way the atheist could prove that in a world without suffering, without evil, that people would freely come to God and find salvation in greater numbers than they do in our world filled with suffering.
Okay.
Well, I think the fact that growth rates in Christian belief are as they are in areas of the world which are afflicted by great suffering is certainly consistent with the Christian hypothesis that God suffuses the world with great suffering in order to bring human beings into a personal relationship with him. But it's also, of course, consistent with a naturalistic hypothesis about the origins of religious belief, that it's as a result of profound emotional need in the face of a threatening and inhospitable world that people are led to religious belief. So I don't think the fact that rates of Christian belief are growing in those parts of the world does anything to support Christian hypothesis. It's consistent with the Christian hypothesis, but it doesn't support it.
Thank you. We've been going now for 2 hours and 10 minutes at full throttle, so I think it's time to bring the formal proceedings to a close. Okay. Who? No, I'm going to stop because there is a further dimension to the night. But at the moment, what I'm going to do is I want to thank the two speakers for a really thoughtful, contentful, respectful, and stamina-filled exchange on tonight. So, thanks very much for the